So I just want to say hello everybody again, and thank you for joining us for our series. This is the fourth in our series of the Fireside Fridays, which we started back in February. Today we're going to speak about what the best time for PhDs to look for jobs or apply for jobs. It's a question that comes up quite frequently in one-to-ones. And before we start, I'm just going to give issue the usual housekeeping, which is that Anne-Marie Kelleher, Dr. Anne-Marie Kelleher is actually a PhD alumni from UCD and has a very interesting job. She has a PhD in linguistics and she's going to talk to me on the topic. So what we will do is Anne-Marie will ask me some questions for 20 minutes and we will go uninterrupted. In the meantime, keep your questions coming into the chat or the Q&A. At the end of the 20 minutes, we will stop the formal recording and then we will continue offline with the Q&A for a further 10 minutes. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you to all my colleagues up in graduate studies. You're all there, and some in the background as well. Emer, James, Janet, and Joanna, and my colleagues from UCD Careers Network, Tara, who we can't see today, and Niamh. But I really want to say thank you to Anne-Marie Kelleher, who is going to be in the seat asking me those questions today. As I said, Anne-Marie, actually maybe Anne-Marie, you can give a little bit of introduction to yourself and then you can start asking me the questions that you're interested in asking.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jaren, and thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to take part in this. As Jaren mentioned, I am an alumni of UCD. My PhD was actually in Spanish, with focus on Spanish poetry and the culture of the USA in the 1920s. So it's a literary background, but I've actually since moved out of academia, really, at least for the moment. And prior to COVID was working in events and have recently just moved to LinkedIn, actually. And I think that's enough time about me. So I'll start with, I suppose, the fundamental question. When would you recommend to start searching and applying for jobs? And I guess arising from that, what advice would you have for balancing this job search with also like the pressure of finishing up your thesis and your PhD in your final year?
Thanks, Anne-Marie. That's a particularly good question, and it's a question I'm asked a lot, and I'm glad we're addressing this now in the Fireside Fridays. Now, I would just want to say, kind of health warning here, that the answer I'm going to give here is from my own, and it's quite an extensive experience in terms of this role and previous roles in this area as well. So, it's, you won't see this written down, but at the same time, what is an absolute fact is, and all my colleagues in the Careers Network would say this, that's 30 to 40 hours of work to put into a successful application. Now, when I mean a successful application, I mean that you're offered a job, and that's the ultimate reason for applying for a job, is that you're going to get it. So 30 to 40 hours from the time you start applying to the time you finish the interview process is 30 to 40 hours. It speeds up a little bit with practice, but in general, that's it. Now, if you actually think about that 30 to 40 hours, that's a week's work. And a week's work is an awful lot just for one job, and if it's coming up to the end of your PhD, I'm sure people would be interested in looking at more than one job, So I have actually, my advice at this stage is it's a terribly stressful time writing up your PhD, and particularly the last 3 months. And 30 to 40 hours is a time out of that 3 months of writing. So my recommendation is that you actually start applying for jobs 6 months before you finish. And, because you've a little bit, it's a little bit more comfortable, but there's a few sensible reasons for that as well. Is it's not even about you, sorry, in terms of, the writing up at the last 3 months, which is very, very stressful, I know, but it's also about the recruitment process. It's actually very slow. So it's quite a safe time to apply, because if you apply, we'll say you're finishing in June, or say you're finishing actually in September.
Yeah.
By applying in March, and you're applying between March and June, that, you won't be going for interviews in March. You won't be, you take Easter into it, you won't be going for interviews.
Yeah, I get you.
And the ideal scenario in my book would be to have somebody finished, have a job on offer before the write-up. It's a very luxurious position to be in, but it's actually very possible. And I can see it extensively over the last year that, there's more and more people have the jobs lined up. And you see, you can, if you have the job lined up, you can extend the starting date a little bit. But there's also, once you're offered a job, there's bits and pieces to be tied up in terms of the contract negotiation and everything. So it's a nice position to be in. And maybe that's a very black and white answer. But
no, I think it helps though to have sort of a definitive kind of idea of a timeline, to think about it specifically from a timeline. And something really interesting that you said about, how time consuming job applications are, and they really are so time consuming. One of the biggest struggles I suppose I've had, and sort of related to that, is sort of discerning in the job search, like what and where, to apply for. So, do you have any advice on how to overcome this and how to find a role that, you're genuinely interested in applying to, given that there's just so much?
Well, again, it's a brilliant question, and the answer to that is, when I'm saying about applying for jobs 6 months before, I'm talking about applying for jobs. But to be ready to be applying for jobs, you would have a lot of work done on yourself, ideally on yourself, obviously with help from your supervisor and from maybe the career service and graduate.
Yeah.
Well, and my colleague, if you actually look back on the last Fireside Friday, when my colleague Niamh O'Connor talks about applying for postdoc, in fact, she talks about, if you're looking for funding, and this is really interesting as well, which is kind of the precursor to an academic position, that work is actually done in third year when you're looking for funding. So that a little bit further back. So if you actually take somebody and, who might be still thinking of an academic role and postdoc, and then others as well, the process in terms of the academic role, like a postdoc getting funding for that, if that goes back to third year, you have a lot of processing done in third year then about what you want in that period, but keeping your options open as well. And the other thing I just want to say as well, I suppose, is, when you're writing up, obviously you don't stop looking for jobs as well. You cannot, especially if you're finishing in September. There'll be very jobs coming up in summer, particularly in, lectureships and ITs and all the rest of it, and postdocs. So of course you apply for them, but you're applying for them and knowing more the ones you really want to go after, that you're prepared to put the time in, but you'll also have practice done. It'll be less, if you've done a few applications and maybe interviews, between the six, going back to March, between March and June, it'll be much less stressful actually even popping in for those jobs that you really want during the summer. So I just want to say that when you're writing up, it's not that you don't apply for jobs, but it's just that you make it more comfortable for yourself, either by having a job lined up or having a lot of practice, and
and I suppose like the more that you've done, you probably get a better idea of, from the interviews as well. If you're looking up to get interviews, well, you know more then about the job that's being offered, and you kind of go, well, actually, I actually don't think that this is maybe a post for me, and it might change you to maybe look slightly elsewhere. So yeah, definitely, that's really great advice to kind of just more is better in some ways in the quantities.
Yes, exactly. Quality is better than quantity all the time. And that, the word discernment, I've used this a few times, but discerning, and that's a process, discerning from almost the time you start the PhD, but that evolves, that discernment.
Yeah.
Discernment about the going for postdoc and going for funding and academic, non-academic and other roles. That's a process over time. So that in that last period of that 3 months, which is actually very vital, that you're quite discerning. The other thing I do say to students as well, and it's just something that again, it's anecdotal and it's from my own experience, is that people who say I've applied for 100 jobs and I haven't got an interview. Well, you won't, and the way to go about it. I actually think there's a maximum number of balls that you can hold in the air, and when I mean balls, I mean applications at any one time, and working with, because once you put in an application, that bit is over, but you'll be working on another one, and then by the time you come to your fourth, then maybe the first one you may be called for interview, or you've been told you're not being called for interview or whatever. But I think there's a maximum that you can actually handle, and my feeling is around four max at any given time at different stages. You're charging ahead with 100 more until you know what's happening with that 4 that they're either ruled out or ruled in. But that's my own personal experience and anecdotal. You won't see that written down.
That makes sense though, absolutely. And I suppose like leading on then from my last question, and again, it's kind of personal to me as well, this idea of like discerning where and what to apply for. A kind of related, I guess, anxiety in some ways is, wondering about, the right role to apply for, and, whether it's a good career choice. And I suppose my question is like, should I focus on looking for, the career job straight out of the gates? Or I suppose, in other words, like how much emphasis should I apply on applying for a job that has a career or like a clear career progression that I know I want? Or, is it okay to be a little bit more up in the air on that and maybe follow a role that sounds good, but you're maybe less certain of where it goes?
I'm going to let you answer that question. And I'll tell you why, Anne-Marie. I think your story is fascinating, and I actually want our students to hear it.
Okay.
And I suppose just to say that when you and I had a conversation about this in December back, about having this chat and what the subject would be, you had a particular role. When I spoke to you 2 weeks ago about just finalizing this in terms of the dates and the technology of it, you've actually got a very interesting one. I'd like the students to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, like it does grow out of my own personal experience, that question. So as I mentioned, like I did my PhD in Spanish. It was literary focus. Um, and then was always kind of torn between, do I want to go into academics or do I not? A large part of me didn't, even though there was some part of me that did. So I thought straight out of finishing my PhD, I would look for a role outside of academics, and actually ended up in event management, which was great experience because it gave me such like industry, like people facing, client facing, very much sort of related to lots of different industries. But I think I knew like within a few months that I didn't want to stay in event management. COVID didn't help. Events were obviously the first thing to go and will be the last thing to come back. So I was laid off actually in January, but in February took up a new role in LinkedIn, as I said, but it is in data annotation, which couldn't be further from event management and is also not really directly linked to my PhD work either, or my research. But I think, I mean, I'm loving it and it's really interesting. It's working with AI and machine learning. So I am using like language and linguistic skills and working with texts. So that's probably where the link came in. But I mean, I would never have considered this as a possible job. I didn't even know it existed until I was actually approached about it. And I don't think it probably even did exist as a role maybe 3-4 years ago. So from my experience, I'm thinking being open to the variety of roles that might be on offer is how I'm kind of considering, you know, career progression at the moment. Especially maybe looking more at like the area you want to work in, or even like the company that you know you want to work for. Because actually, even since we last talked last week, my current role was talking with one of my managers, and there's a possibility for it to expand in the coming months to use the Spanish that I have, which wasn't something that was originally posted in the job vacancy, but is now something that they'll make use of because I bring language skills with me. So I think, yeah, being really open to not focusing on I want a job as this. There might actually be roles where you don't even know they exist yet.
Yeah, okay. I think that's a brilliant example, and it highlights what I've actually been saying for years is that you know, roles change over time. Roles that you know, a role, you could go on obsessing about a role that's there at the moment, but you're closing the opportunities to roles that are just coming on stream or that we don't even know exist. And the other thing that we need to watch is job titles. I noticed myself over the years, they change. I mean, from the you know, in my last job, and I moved into the role I'm in 3 years ago, into UCD 3 years ago, and you know, I saw this new role advertised it was in the IT sector, and I thought this must be new. But when I actually looked into the job description, it was actually the same role that was the same skills were used in other jobs on, but the title had changed. So this is the thing that you have to kind of watch over time, is that if you obsess about titles and roles, so you also have to think about your skills, you know, and how you could apply them. And there's just never been a better time. I think that we're at the cusp of something very big. And I mean, that's very obvious. The world is changing so much. So yeah, looking backwards all the time on roles that somebody had 5 years ago and you'd like to do that, that's fine. And it you know, it's very, very good idea. But I'd always say, don't be blinkered into being obsessed about, particularly around now, because there's so many burgeoning opportunities like you would have described that you could leave, that you could close off to.
Yeah. I even think it's maybe possibly one of the few silver linings from COVID is I definitely, because obviously all last year I was essentially job searching and early in this year, is that I think there is much greater openness to going down, you know, an indirect route from your educative or research background, or even like changing position. I think because COVID is kind of forcing people to do so, and for like companies to be really adaptable as well, even just in terms of things that are kind of being promoted on the likes of LinkedIn and stuff about adaptability and looking for people with, you know, specific skills, but not necessarily you have to have experience in whatever a specific role was, you know. So I suppose that's encouraging in many ways.
It is, and it's also something that I've observed over the years. You know, and again, I have so many stories about it. But you're a really good example of somebody that's got into a role called a data. You're actually called a data annotator, isn't that right? Yeah. You and I have never heard. I hadn't heard about it until you mentioned it last week. So I think that's fascinating, but typical. But I think something you've said there that that since you went into the job, now that it's now observed or known that you have good Spanish because of your PhD, it's now being used. I would say very soon other skills that you have brought with you from the PhD are going to be tapped into and used as well, because this happens over and over again. We have stories of people going into you know, a pharma company and you know, they go in a particular role, and then somebody realizes, oh, they're very good at this because they've learned in the PhD, and suddenly a role is created.
And just as a quick question kind of on that, say you know, you might feel a little bit insecure, not personally insecure, but like less certain of taking a role and not really knowing where it might go. Is there any way to sort of make yourself more secure in that, you know, some steps to put in place before you undertake the role?
That's a very good question, and I'm really glad you said it, Anne-Marie, because it's come up an awful lot in the last few months with students that have actually got jobs, so or have been offered jobs, and they ask this question. So my answer to that at the moment is, yeah, you could be a little bit uncertain. You know, you're never 100% sure, but if there's an awful lot of you and your gut and going with this, you know, your gut and something tells you that this seems right, but you're also a little bit unsure. I would encourage everybody to build in a 6-month review before you know, as they're signing the contract or before they sign the contract. Now, having said all that, it's usually there anyway.
Yeah.
If it's not there, ask for it. So at that 6-month point, and then another one at 12-month as well, obviously, but particularly the 6-month, because at that point you can actually raise, or you know, it's a two-way conversation. You know, like what's happened to you, they've observed already that you have Spanish, so they want to use that Spanish. But you know, another student would have, or graduate at that stage, would have something else that could be tapped into the 6 months, and suddenly they're going to start using it, or you know, another role is created, or you know, and salary can be discussed at that stage as well. So I think the safeguard is a 6-monthly review, and then you know that, you know, you're giving yourself 6 months to really shine. You know, there's great. There'd be great incentive in yourself to just I'm grabbing this opportunity in for 6 months, but then it's also an opportunity for you to reflect at the end of that 6 months. Am I going to do another 6 months? Or you know, and then ask for another view. You know, but it's like what we say about as you're doing your PhD as well. Reflect on what you're learning along the way, but equally when you go into the job, reflect on what you're doing in the first 6 months and work out if that's what more of that you want to do, or less, or whatever. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just aware that we're running out of time, about 2 minutes left. So just very quickly on my last question, because it is something that I briefly mentioned, of not being certain of, you know, pursuing an academic or a non-academic role. Do you sort of any advice for those who maybe are undecided there? They don't know which way to go down because they're maybe torn between being still interested in both or not knowing.
I think Niamh covered this quite well in our last Fireside Friday about, you know, the postdoc procedure. And in those scenarios, there's wonderful opportunities now. If you're undecided about I'm going to say a postdoc because that's the route to an academic career in many cases. There's great opportunities for co-funded postdocs. And I think going in, I should say there's no right or wrong. You can you can go into industry and always come back into academia. You know, there is research funding. You know, that isn't really a problem. Or if you go into a postdoc role, you can always go into industry, you know, and there's training, particularly in a place like UCT. But, you know, at the same time, at the very outset, if you are a bit unsure, I think ideally a co-funded postdoc where you'd have a leg, certainly a leg in academia, but also a leg in an organization. Doesn't even have to be industry. It could be an organization like an NGO, so that, you know, you're kind of you're running in parallel and you're getting a feed for both, but your CV is very lively as well because it has the institutional side, but also has the outside of academia. So it's something that I would really watch out for if you're unsure, is that co-funded, and there's going to be absolutely no doubt more of those coming on stream. That's great. SFI, etc. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jaren. I mean, it's so helpful, all the advice that you gave. I think especially to do with being aware that job titles and roles change so much, and keeping open to that, and so focusing on the broader opportunities out there. And also great advice in terms of taking control of your career and your job search from so early on. being in some ways methodical about it so that you don't run up against the stress of putting in your PhD and also job searching in those final months.
That's not a pretty sight. I just want to say before we close the formal recording here is that our next Fireside Friday is going to be on Friday the 16th of April, and what we're going to be talking about then is why are PhDs so sought after in the startup sector. And I'll have Darren Whelan from Output Sports. He's an alumni of UCD indeed as well, and he actually is in a very, very successful startup, and I will actually be asking the question. So I just want to say that before we close off the formal recording, and then Anne-Marie, you will take the Q&A then maybe when we finish.